Order and welcome to this one-off evidence session on disability and ill health in the workplace. And we're delighted to welcome our first panel. We have Chris Russell from the Federation of Small Business, Ian Cass from the Forum of Private Business, but also Chairman of Micro Business Alliance, Tom Pollard from Mind, and James Taylor from Scope. So it's very good to see you all, and thank you for sparing your time to come to give evidence to the committee. I'm going to kick off, if it's okay, and I would like to start by mentioning, in terms of the Keep Britain Working paper, which was published last November. It identified a number of different issues, and particularly in terms of the issues around the structural concerns about disabled people being able to get into the workforce, but also in terms of the concerns about employees and employers. I just wondered, if I could start with Chris and with Ian, whether you have experienced that through your businesses. You also have concerns about the health of employees in the workplace.
You want me to? Yes, to a degree. So the pandemic was definitely a tipping point for a lot of things in the small and micro business world, and that probably, along with technology and the driving technology, has definitely changed working patterns. We're still dealing with a lot of that. What I would say is I think there's a danger. It's something I say quite often, but small and micro business isn't big business, only smaller. It's completely different, and the issues around big business sometimes are very, very different when you look at a small and micro business, where it's an individual business owner. They're a generalist. They're trying to do everything. They're trying to be the HR director, the finance director, the salesperson, the marketing, and within mental health, I would say, I think that the micro and small business world are dealing with it better. Because if you're working with a small group of people on a day-to-day basis, their well-being and looking after them, I think, is part of the heart of your business. Those small and micros very often are a community as well, yes, where they work with other ones. So I do think we need to make that distinction between the way things happen in the big business world and the small and micro business world. I think there is a difference, and I think that small and micros are dealing with that better. That's my...
Just to build on Ian's point, which I completely agree with what he's saying there. If you look at the department stats on small and micro businesses compared to large businesses, disabled people are proportionally more likely to work at small and micro businesses or be self-employed compared to large businesses. Also, on the stats the department published on Friday, you can see that 9% of employees working at large employers have taken 4 weeks or more off in the past 12 months, and that's compared to 2% for those who work at small businesses. So, just to build on Ian's point, I think there's a strong case that small businesses are actually a lot better at this than large businesses.
What, on average, is sort of the employment rate for not just disabled people, but people with long-term conditions in small businesses? And I absolutely acknowledge what you're saying in terms of the challenges, what Ian particularly picked up on, the challenges that especially micros face. For people who don't know what a micro is, between 1 and 9 employees, is that right? Yeah. And 95% of businesses are micros, which not everybody will be aware of. It's 5.5 million, I think.
And as a sector, just another thing about it is it's growing, in that you've got a lot of businesses that maybe used to be medium-sized businesses with 20-25 employees, again, technology has been a driver of that, and this thing about work patterns where you're outsourcing a lot of this, so you end up with a core employee base of maybe 9 people, but then you've got all these other things that, you're outsourcing your social media, your website, somebody's doing your books, so you're outsourcing that. So there are some significant businesses, we can't be dismissive of them in that micro and small sector. There are world leaders in there, but they're just a lot of they're lean and they're using the technology in a clever way, and a lot got pushed, a lot moved that way with the pandemic. It kind of forced them to go, oh Christ, maybe we should be selling online. What can I do digitally? So a lot more of them engage with the digital world because of what happened in the pandemic. So it's an interesting change, and as I say, we're still dealing with some of the issues around that.
Chris, I'm sorry if I put you on the spot there, but do you happen to know the employment rate for disabled people and in small businesses? And don't worry if you don't. That's
I actually do have the stat published. This is Department for Work and Pension stats. So 45% of disabled people in employment work at a small workplace compared to 42% of non-disabled people in employment. And then 13% of disabled people in employment work as self-employed compared to 11.9% of non-disabled workers. So I don't have the stats for large businesses, but you can see that proportionally disabled people, those with long-term health conditions, are
all
more
need to
likely.
do better. It's not just it's not just
Although I would add, go back to that point, that it's actually at small businesses that employees are taking less sick leave than at large businesses.
Right.
And I think, the way I see it is, obviously, if you're a micro business, you don't really have HR support. You don't have, the business owner are also the HR person, as Ian said earlier. But I think it's really about that other, the sort of person-to-person support that you're able to provide as a small business owner. And if you look at the review, it does sort of mention that about rehumanising the workplace, I think they called it, but probably could have expanded on that a little bit more, I felt like, in the review.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Tom and James, what from perspective of organisations that support people with chronic conditions and with disability, what are your take in terms of how of the report and particularly as we're looking at small businesses today, how this could be better, how we could better support people in work and to stay in work?
Yeah, so I think we broadly welcome the recommendations in the review, and I know we'll come on to talk about them in more detail later, and kind of broadly agree with the diagnosis in the report. So it suggested that there's this culture of fear among employees and employers around health and disability. I think that is right, is what we see in our work, that often there's an inadequate support when people do need help, and again, I think that's right. And then, as you say, it also identifies kind of structural challenges. And I guess my instinct would be that actually those structural challenges are probably the most significant driver when we're thinking about things like the scale of economic inactivity due to health and disability. And it's probably the aspect that's kind of least addressed by the report. And I think it's understandable because the scope of the review is looking at what can be done within workplaces. And I think a lot of those structural factors kind of cut across that. But I think they're really important to be aware of, because I think the risk otherwise is that we overweight what can be done through a kind of like occupational health space and underweight what needs to happen at a more macro level. So health problems and disabilities like have a strong socio-economic gradient, right? So you're more likely to be ill or disabled if you're from a lower socio-economic background, and equally growing up in poverty or living with deprivation, you're more likely to become disabled or unwell. But also there's really interesting relationships around things like education. So people with a high level of education suffer much less in terms of their kind of earnings potential over their lifetime as a result of a disability. So there's kind of a multiplier effect that if you have low educational attainment, and also health and disability issues, there's kind of a compounding effect there. And then there's also things like geographical context. So people with health problems and disabilities, especially those who are out of work because of health and disability, are kind of more likely to cluster in parts of the country where there's fewer economic opportunities. there's lots of intersection with things like people from racialised communities. So there's a whole bunch of like structural factors at play in determining who is out of work because of health and disability. And to be crude, the sort of jobs people are likely to be looking at going into if they've spent a period out of work because of poor health and disability are also likely to be the sort of parts of the labour market where they're less likely to get good support in work. So I think the risk is that we look at like good practice in large employers, for example, and we say, well, what can be done to kind of improve the field in that sense, but we miss the bigger picture, which is that like poor quality, insecure work is leading to lots of people becoming unwell, and then people who are out of work because of health and disability are going to struggle to get into the sort of jobs that will provide the right kind of support. So I think it's just important that we keep that kind of bigger picture in mind. I think the kind of aspiration of the review to kind of drive a kind of race to the top is welcome, but we've had lots of previous reports around work and health where we say, well, let's focus on working with the willing and driving a kind of race to the top, which probably haven't really got to the root of a lot of the problems we're seeing in the labour market.
Oh, really helpful, Tom. Thank you. James?
Really agree with everything Tom's just said. And I think even the report says itself, there's no silver bullet to solving disability unemployment. But to pick up on one thing that Tom said around education, the University of Sheffield published some research last year which found that if every disabled adult the same level of education as non-disabled adults, you would reduce the disability employment gap by 6%. There's a whole host of things that are needing to happen around the workplace. From our perspective, I think a good set of recommendations for medium and large employers, which seems to be the focus of the review. But as we've heard from the panel already, that isn't where most people work and isn't where most disabled people work. And I think there is a challenge for how... There's two things for me. The first is there are some amazing micro businesses and small businesses that are doing incredible things with disabled people to support them into employment and keep them there. Scope invest in lots of small businesses that employ disabled people. We invest in a recruitment agency that has is only staffed by neurodiverse people and focuses on roles for neurodiversity. There's a brewery in South East London that employs people with a learning disability. There's a chocolate manufacturer that employs disabled people. Micro businesses are amazing at being able to just do things. Don't get caught up in the bureaucracy of HR or loads of different policies and practices. And I think what the review doesn't quite do, and I think what we need to do, is how can we learn from all this great stuff small businesses can do and roll it out nationally, and then backwards, as I think we've heard, what can we learn from some of the bigger businesses around adjustments that smaller businesses could be learning from. So there's lots of positives in the review, but I don't think it ever did, but it hasn't covered the full spectrum of the things that need to happen to
very fair
tackle
point, and hopefully my colleagues will draw that now. But thank you so much. We're going to move on. Joanna Baxter.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. So the first of the three recommendations in the report is the development of a healthy working life cycle. The report envisages this becoming a formal accreditation and standard, with the aim of preventing problems from arising in the first place. So what difference could that make, and what are the challenges to implementing it? I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll jump in. Yeah, again. It sounds like a good idea. My field is small and micros. I can't speak for big business, but I would imagine when you've got an HR department and the resource to implement it, it's going to be easier than it is for smaller businesses to implement, to put programs into place. As we've said before, you've kind of got owner-operators, couples, whatever. They might be good at one thing, but they struggle at certain others and they have to outsource. So that's where the challenge is going to lie. When you get to the smaller and micros, it's giving them the support and help to be able to implement a program like that. That's going to be the challenge, as it is with a great many things. But certainly that would be the case with that one. That's one of the main challenges you're going to face.
I mean, from our perspective, the recommendations are a little bit, I'm going to say, puzzling, because on the one hand, the review talks about an urgent crisis, and then on the other hand, you're going to have a bunch of vanguards feeding back information, set up a workforce health intelligence unit that feeds back information to build a standard, and then that standard is going to give you more incentives. It feels pretty convoluted, and I think there's things the government could do which would actually support small businesses a lot more. We talk a lot about statutory sick pay rebate, where 34% of our members said that rebate would encourage them to employ more people currently not in employment. And then for reference, like 5% said more support from the job centre and 8% said occupational health support. So I think if there is an urgent crisis, there are things the government can do to tackle economic inactivity pretty quickly without going through this huge so it's going to take so many years to get to this point. And I think it is very convoluted, and I really struggle to see why a small business owner would sign up to be a vanguard. I've tried to explain it to our members, and they don't understand it. They have no interest. They're too busy running their business. And I think you end up with the risk that you're trying to put solutions that are suitable for large businesses into small businesses, and it's really, small businesses are doing this better. I've just read out the stats saying there's less long-term sickness absence at small businesses. So why are we trying to implant a large business solution which isn't working onto small businesses?
Yeah, so at Mind we have a thing we run called the Mental Health at Work Commitment, which is basically, so there's 4,000 employers who are signed up to this, and it is kind of setting out that healthy working lifestyle with regards to mental health. So it's saying, what does it look like to create a mentally healthy workplace, but also to support people when they are unwell, to support people when they're off to return to work. So I think a lot of that knowledge is out there, particularly for mental health. I think it's right in the report that they talk about going beyond just accreditation and having kind of something that is more active, because in our experience, something that is just about accreditation, and I'd argue, I think we might come on to this later, but something like Disability Confident has tended to be like, you get your accreditation, that's kind of it. Yeah. So I think it has to be much more active than that. But I worry that there's some areas where there's been a pretty clear case for a long time about the things you need to do to support people around mental health at work, many of which actually support your broader base of employees as well. And some of that stuff still doesn't happen. So we know that like the line management relationship is absolutely critical to mental health. So like that's going to determine often whether you become unwell in terms of, as a result of stress, but also it will be the thing that mediates whether you can return to work, like what that relationship looks like. And yet my experience from working in kind of a range of different employment settings is that it's often something that's neglected. We don't recruit line managers based on line management skills. We recruit based on just seniority and whether you've done the job below. We don't do a lot of training and prioritization of like one-to-one. So there's kind of some basic stuff that we know would make a big difference, and it doesn't happen. So I'm not convinced necessarily that gathering more evidence about what the right thing to do is going to be the thing that drives it. And it comes back to this strategy of like, working with the willing is worthwhile, and that's a good thing to do, and demonstrating that these vanguards gain real economic benefits from doing this stuff, great. But previous evidence would suggest that's not necessarily the thing that is going to drive widespread adoption of the kind of practice we need to see.
I think there is quite a bit of positives from it, from my perspective. One is it's really good to see the social model of disability reflected in policy and review. That's something that doesn't happen frequently, that recognises disability is caused by the barriers put in place, in this case by workplaces. And I think it's encouraging to read about the importance of healthy, stigma-free conversation. So many disabled people that I speak to talk about a culture of fear in the workplace, not a fear of a fear of managers, line managers, not wanting to say the wrong thing, and then there's no conversation at all, and it's entirely up to the disabled person, often quite junior, to advocate for themselves, which can't be the place that we are in. So I think that is positive to see that reflected. I think, like Tom and Mind, for us it's what happens as a result of this life cycle. How do we make it consistent across every employer? Because there have been lots of reviews, there are lots of different models out there. Why is this the best one?
The report also talks about an improved workplace health provision, which would also be a certified standard and paid for by employers. So do you support that recommendation, including the proposal to make or require employers to pay for it? And how much of a difference do you think that will make?
I come in. I think we certainly wouldn't support extra taxation on businesses. I think from the surveys we've done, when employment costs go up, it is more likely that small businesses reduce their recruitment activity, but it's also a question of who they recruit, and because of rising employment costs and regulations, they tend to look for better qualified, more experienced workers, and they tend to avoid those with gaps in their CV or who are currently out of the labour market. And as such, because of some of the structural factors that Tom was going into, this can mean that disabled people are unfortunately overlooked. I think increasing employment costs can be very counterproductive. I think having a service that gives good examples, good case studies of what a business could do is broadly welcome. But I would also go back to 2014 when the government introduced something very similar, funded because they stopped the SSP rebate back in 2014 and said they're going to introduce something very similar with the money they were spending on the SSP rebate called the Health and Work Service, but this only lasted a couple of years. So I guess in principle, if it was funded out of general taxation and they've learnt the lessons from over a decade ago, we might be supportive, but I think both of those are pretty big ifs. Yeah.
And just to say, my recollection of what happened around that service previously, I think the idea was that government would kind of provide a kind of occupational health function to organisations that didn't really have that. My recollection of that was that there just wasn't a huge amount of take-up. And you do have a challenge here where you have a problem of the employers that aren't doing this stuff well are probably not going to be the ones that are going to come forward and actively seek help to do it better. I mean, I think overall the kind of aspiration around having a more constructive conversation around how do you manage sickness absence and how do you support someone back to work is right. And I think there are undoubtedly challenges around that being currently mediated by the GP and the fit note. Like I think it is a fair criticism to say that GPs don't have a kind of, often will not have a clear sense of like what kind of processes and support could be put in place to help someone remain in work. I think the challenge at the moment, because a lot of this in the report felt like it was getting towards wanting reform around the fit note. And, you know, I think we're open to that. I think the challenge is it has become a somewhat kind of confrontational system where people seek a fit note in order to get signed off because they're worried about kind of being pressured to work otherwise. And so I think if you're going to shift that conversation, and I think it should be shifted, the thing you've got to make sure happens is that it does remain a kind of trusting, consensual, constructive process, because I think the fear would be, and there is some talk in the report about introducing kind of greater conditionality around sick pay and saying that people have to engage with staff. I think the fear is as soon as you get into a place where people are feeling kind of pressured by an employer or by some third party to have to engage with the process, people can often kind of hunker down in that situation and become quite defensive. So I think opening up a more constructive conversation around what can a return to work look like, what can someone staying in work when they're unwell look like, is great. I think it's really difficult to do, and that's kind of why the fit note exists as it does at the moment, and I think there's real challenges around how you overhaul that.
I'd be very careful about adding any more cost to businesses at the moment. I say I'm a generalist, and I talking to members, so this is good. I haven't got data around it, but the feeling with most at the moment is that this is survival time. Nobody's looking to grow because nobody's looking at taking any risks. So the market out there is very, very risk averse, and adding more costs on won't help, particularly those industries where you don't have the option of technology. We're seeing it already in hospitality. You know, you can't have a machine serving beer, or AI doesn't do it. You know, it's, by the way, I went to if it's the one in Sydenham you're talking about, the brewery, and it's mind-blowing. You should go. It's fantastic, the job they do. But hospitality, you need the people there. And costs have gone up, and we've seen what's happening to, you know, we are losing perfectly viable pubs for the wrong reasons. So I do think you've got to be very, very careful when you're adding more cost to employing people in at a time when people are very, very risk averse about adding any cost to that business. A lot of them really are in, we've got to survive this at the moment, and I'm afraid that's a general state of the small and micro business people I talk to.
James?
I mean, that might be true, and hear what my colleague here is saying. I think, for me, a couple of things in the workplace health provision. One, it's great that there could be some facilitated conversation. Tom is right, GPs aren't really the best place to decide what adjustments someone might need in the workplace. But to me, it read like a conversation that's happened possibly a bit too late. Actually, the way you keep people healthy, particularly disabled people healthy in the workplace, have a conversation at the very beginning. What do you need to succeed? Rather than how can we stop you leaving? That should be the backstop. The first port of call is how can we support you? The second, I think, is just need to think about how this translates into the reality of work. Many people work from home. Employers can't control those environments. How do we keep our employees safe when they're not in our building or our office? I'm not saying we should all go back to work, but that is something to consider. And then I think the third thing, which maybe we'll touch on a bit later, is incentives for employers to hire disabled people. Government can't bear all of the costs of tackling the disability employment gap. There has to be a role for employers too, and we think there has to be some incentives in there for them to be taking on and retaining disabled people in the workplace.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, colleagues, so and our lovely panel. So if you could keep your responses succinct as well as your questions. Thank you. John Mill.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. So the third recommendation in the report is the Workplace Health Intelligence Unit, which we referred to earlier. The idea is to sort of set up a positive feedback loop where it informs and improves the other two recommendations. A simple question, really. Do we think we really need another body to drive reform on top of all the bodies that have existed in the past? Tom, you sort of touched on this earlier, I think, so I think I know where your views are.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not necessarily averse to it. I think more rigorously collecting and collating data and broader evidence is welcome. I do think the challenge is more about like implementation rather than a lack of knowledge at the moment. And I think there's also a risk that the data will skew towards the experience of larger employers who are able to gather, much larger data sets. And also, again, we'll be focusing on like where has good practice been effective rather than spotting the kind of broader structural factors that are disadvantaging disabled people. So I think it's kind of welcome. I'm not sure how much of a difference it would necessarily make.
James?
I think it's a good thing. There isn't enough data on what works. There's loads of great practice, loads of good practice, loads of resources, loads of toolkits, loads of guides. There's nothing definitive on if you do this thing, you will improve the experience of your disabled employees, you'll recruit more, and you'll improve your bottom line. I mean, on paper, it sounds like a good thing, but proof is in how it's executed.
Thank you.
I mean, I broadly agree with Tom and James. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I guess our big concern is most of the vanguards so far seem to be large businesses who have a lot of resources. As a matter of fact, the data suggests smaller businesses are doing it better. So how can we really learn from smaller businesses would be, I think, the main challenge if this unit is set up.
Thank you.
Yeah, you haven't got the data at the moment. It's as simple as that. I was at a meeting with the Office of National Statistics the other day. The only people that are filling in surveys are the larger companies who have a statutory requirement to do so. So basically, you're not getting enough data from what makes up 99% of the UK economy, because they're not. So yes, there's definitely an issue with the data that you're working on at the moment.
Thank you. And so one of the new intelligence unit's key jobs will be to design incentives. And James, you predicted this question last time, right? So that's incentives both for employers and for employees. So what kind of incentives do you think they could create, and what's the balance between employer and employees?
Yeah, and it has to be a balance, doesn't it? Because we need employers to hire and retain disabled people and people with long-term health conditions, and we need employees to go to those organisations. Two, I think you can't just simply push all the responsibility to employers to solve the problem. I guess there's a couple of things that we've been thinking about. One is the role of national insurance contributions and whether that could be rebated to small and medium employers. It's something that's happened in the past to moderate success, that smaller businesses who recruited disabled people or people with health conditions received a rebate over so many months to keeping them in the workplace for 3 to 6 months or so. But, I think we probably want to look across what organisations are providing to the workplace health intelligence unit to develop them properly. But I think there just have to be something. There are some sticks around better reporting. I think the one thing the review perhaps doesn't talk about much is like the benefit to the business itself of having a diverse workforce. And this isn't just a social justice argument, it's a profitability economic argument. Lots of research from the States particularly around employing disabled people improves your profit margins by 2-3% in some places.
Yeah, so I think we welcome a focus on incentives, and I think if you're going to go beyond kind of just working with the willing, then you probably do need to have kind of something more in place. I think you need to recognise that there are kind of different challenges you need to be incentivising for those. So the experience of someone who is in work already, who maybe develops a mental health problem, that's quite a different challenge to someone who's been out of work for a long time and is struggling to get back into work. And you might need quite different incentives to incentivise a response to those problems. And then the third challenge would be lots of people living in areas where there just aren't many jobs going. So I think there's something about how do you kind of more proactively intervene in the labour market to create jobs for people, and you can think about how the public sector can do that, but also through procurement, which is mentioned in the report. But then I think you want to be smart about designing incentives that aren't going to put extra costs on employers who are already doing the right thing, but are going to provide a genuine incentive to try and tackle some of these problems. I think when it comes to kind of incentives for and obligations for employees, I think that is a tricky area, because I think what we have seen in the benefit system is that when you try and lean on kind of conditionality to drive behaviour, you do end up with quite a kind of adversarial system. So I think I'd be really cautious about any move towards more conditionality on employees.
Thank you. Yeah, I used to work in advertising. I believe in incentives, not sanctions. But anyway, employers' perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to build on James's point, I mentioned a stat earlier about 34% of our members saying an ability to reclaim a rebate on statutory sick pay costs would encourage them to hire people currently out of the labour market. We also asked about financial incentives, and 44% said that would be helpful, and that's the second top-rated factor behind if it was just cheaper to employ people in general. So, as James was saying, I mean, our view is you could do a tax credit system similar to what is the case with veterans at the moment, where you get a bit of a rebate on your NICS costs if you employ someone who is disabled or who is currently out of work. economically inactive. I guess the question I would have is whether to link it to the standard, and I think that is the tricky thing, because standards in general, it tends to be the case that larger businesses sign up to them more just because they have the staff to be able to tick all the right boxes and join that initiative, whereas a small business might be doing all the right things but just doesn't bother signing up to the standard because it's yet another thing to do for the time-poor business owner.
Briefly?
Keep it quick. Big business still has the tendency to think if you're present and you look busy, you're being productive. And that's something they've got to deal with. Small micro businesses are changing the work patterns and the way they work. And the reason I mention that is because I don't like spending time and money on things that you don't have to. I think you're sat on a huge opportunity at the moment with the small and micro business sector, in that you've got that sector that's looking at more flexible working. They're used to people working at home. They need to buy in the expertise because they're not experts. But I don't want a full-time employee, but somebody doing a couple of days here and a day there. There's a massive opportunity, not only for people with various disabilities, but also that older workforce that are retiring. But actually, I would like to work a couple of days a week. So I think there's two things that need doing, and neither of them are going to cost a lot of money. One of them is to be telling the positive stories, like the brew. You've got to get those stories out there. I'm a salesman. You tell stories, and nobody's telling those stories at the moment about how it's working and best practice. So I think you need to get those stories out there. And then the other one, which I haven't got an answer to, but it's that challenge of how do you put those potential workers and all these small and micro businesses that I think could be willing, because what's in it for them? Well, it's great because I can bring somebody in who's a specialist to do a few days a week. So telling the stories and finding a way of bringing those potential workers and the businesses together. And I think you've got a massive opportunity there that, regardless of all these other bits and pieces, if you can capitalise on that, that's going to solve a hell of a lot of the problem. So,
thank you.
Thank you so much. Lee Barron.
Yeah, obviously conscious of time, so I'll kind of chuck mine together to do some quick fire kind of answer. First of all, the report sets out a 7-year timeline for implementation. How realistic do you think that is? And just also, does the report have much support amongst the businesses that you represent? And are any of those businesses you represent participating in the Vanguard phase? And also, really, to Tom and James, is there much interest in the report amongst disabled people? So it's the timelines and then basically the support that's there.
7 years feels like quite a long time when the first line in the report is this is a quiet but urgent crisis. Don't know if 7 years quite feels urgent enough to me, but appreciate getting these things off the ground and collecting the evidence and creating the standards does take time. I think we would like to see some, what's going to happen in the next 6 months, what's going to happen in the next year, because the employment gap between disabled people is just getting bigger. Does it have support amongst disabled people? I think lots of the things in here disabled people would welcome. There's something it doesn't really talk about that much, which is adjustments and access to work, which I think many disabled people we speak to find frustrating and infuriating. Not quite clear how the report is going to fix that thing, but it has to. So I think some support. 7 years feels quite long.
Just to agree with that, and exactly. You've got an urgent crisis. When you're going to implement your recommendations over a 7-year time period, it doesn't seem right. And as I mentioned before, there are things the government could do immediately which would have a big impact, such as SSP rebate. I would be very surprised if many of our members had heard of. We haven't done any surveys on whether they've heard of this review or not, but I would be astonished if many of them have, because they're just busy people and they've got a lot of other stuff going on. And I'd be very surprised.
I don't have a huge amount to add to what James said. I think it's welcome that Charlie Mayfield seems to be staying on to be involved in like pushing for implementation. I think a failure of previous reports has been that like the report gets written and handed over, and then you kind of hope that it gets implemented. So I think having something a bit more structured, I think it talks about building a partnership between employers, providers, trade unions and government, and I think if you were looking at like big systemic change, then that probably is the right kind of time scale. I guess I'd just query whether that is the scale of ambition in the report at the moment. It still feels broadly like working with the willing and building a bit of a movement rather than kind of more fundamental systemic change.
7 years feels too long. And in terms of engagement with our members on both, I would say it's never come up in conversation about the report or anybody being a vanguard. So simple.
Thank you, Lee. Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. Turning to reasonable adjustments, I mean, Ian, you highlighted some of the challenges being faced by business at the moment, the pressures they're under in terms of trying to grow and trying to stand still. Can I ask the panel, I'll start with Ian and Chris, in terms of do you think a sufficient number of reasonable adjustments are being made by business, and what more could be done to support that, be it guidance, be it further support from government or incentives? I mean, you touched on some of the incentives earlier. Can I just maybe start with you two on that?
So, I guess I'd just say employers could always do more, right? They can always make more adjustments and always provide more support, and I think that is a given. I mean, when we surveyed our members, for those who employ disabled people, those with long-term health conditions, we found 80% make adjustments. I think workplace adjustments, I should say. I think most of that is quite sort of flexibly done. So flexible working, as Ian mentioned earlier, is a big thing, but they wouldn't necessarily go to the effort of changing people's employment contracts. So just have a sort of ad hoc arrangement. But they, in general, they do make a lot of effort and they do really care about their staff. Of course, there are employers who don't do all the right things, and they should, and they should be taken to tribunal if they're not doing the right things. I think the difficulty, I have actually spoken to the department in the past about how they could provide more guidance on reasonable adjustments, because I do think it would be helpful if there was more clear-cut guidance. The problem is reasonable adjustments in law is quite a vague kind of concept. So they said that legally it's quite tricky for them to provide very precise guidance on what reasonable adjustments an employer could make. And I think that is a difficulty. But there must be a way around that. There must be a way to give more information, support and guidance which manages to get around that issue.
Ian, how about small and micro businesses?
If it adds cost, both and cost not just monetary, quite often the higher cost to a micro business is time out in doing something else when you're not then growing and developing your own business. That's the barrier to it. But the point, James mentioned that thing about the benefit to the business, and I think if they see there's a different way of doing this and bringing somebody in and making reasonable adjustments, and that's going to be for the benefit of the business, then I think, yeah, and a lot of them are already doing that. I think you'll find far more flexibility within that micro and small sector. Hybrid working requires you to write a separate contract, really, because it's not, there's part-time working, full-time working. If you agree a way of working with somebody, writing that contract of employment between the two, and I'm seeing a lot of that happening in the small and micro business sector anyway. But it could get better, and I think that's where a bit of more education and guidance would help in things.
Tom and James, have you got anything to add on that in terms of support you think?
I just think, again, there'll probably be quite a fundamental difference between the experience of someone who's in work and maybe develops a mental health problem versus someone who's trying to get into work. So I think someone who's been in work for a while, and let's say it's a supportive employer, they have a good line manager relationship, I imagine, particularly post-pandemic, there will be a greater receptiveness to kind of flexibility around working patterns and adjustments. I think for someone who's out of work and looking to get into work, we hear people being really worried and unsure about whether and when to disclose that they have a mental health problem. whether and when to ask for adjustments. When you're new to a job, your fear would be that if you're asking for adjustments and saying you need flexibility, that's going to disadvantage you in a kind of competitive job market. So I think we need to get to a place where people feel confident they can ask for that without fear of it leading to discrimination. I don't think that's where we're at yet.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that from work we've done that many employers are not meeting their duty under the Equality Act to provide reasonable adjustments. And the problem we've just heard, it's impossible to define the word reasonable. It's completely different to you, to me, to anybody in this room, what reasonable means. And I think that is the real challenge we have with adjustments. What we hear from some HR managers is that they think disabled people are too expensive. Right? And I don't think we can have a system where those who require greater support are denied the opportunity to succeed in work just because they need some additional financial support. Now, it shouldn't just be on employers to bear that cost. Maybe there's some work around tax incentives for adjustments themselves. Disability confident network of 20,000 employers, maybe there's a purchasing power collective that group could put together to bulk buy adjustments. Maybe there's incentives for technology companies to develop new technological adjustments. But our understanding is that many people are not getting the adjustments they need because the word reasonable is not understood, it's not defined properly, and we think that should be changed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Steve Darling.
Thank you. My first little bit of a question is to Ian and Chris, which is, what awareness do you think there is in the businesses that you engage with around access to work? How many of them actually use it or even aware of it? And then also on the more broadly to the panel, I'd like to ask you, it's potentially a really useful scheme. I know I personally, with my disability, have benefited from it for many years, but it's also a bit cumbersome and challenging at times, is the kind way of putting it. Any reflections on what you would hope in an ideal world alterations there would be to make it more effective? But if I could hear from Chris and Ian first on awareness of it, would be really helpful.
I think awareness isn't where it should be, and one of the reasons for that is they do, we've said, we're painting this picture of these people, individuals or couples that are, partners, whatever, they're focused on the business and developing that, and so you've got to give them a good reason to actually pick up on these things. And we saw, when something like auto enrolment came along, yes, people picked up on it, but even at the last minute on the last day, the phone lines, our helplines went crazy. I'm sure they did at the FSB. Or what do we do about them? Because they've not noticed it. You almost need the old salesman's fear clothes. You've got to give them a reason so raising the awareness it's not. The awareness isn't where it should be.
First of all, I think access to work is overall a very good scheme. I think awareness amongst small business employers isn't high, and definitely could be higher, as Ian mentioned. FSB also represents self-employed people, and we actually find that their awareness is growing, and they really benefit from the scheme, and it can often be the case between them staying in work and them leaving the labour market because of the support access to work provides. I think the main problem, as I see it, is the waiting times and the application process. The support the scheme provides is fantastic, but if the department's able to address waiting times and doing something about the application process, I think that would be really beneficial, because it's a great scheme in general.
And any further reflections of if Stephen Timms was Father Christmas and you were writing to him of what you'd want for improvements to access to work, what would they be?
For us, I do think it would be helpful thinking of having a separate self-employment sort of stream within the scheme, because we just talked about reasonable adjustments. Obviously, a self-employed person doesn't have an employer to make reasonable adjustments for them. So in many ways, they could benefit from more support because there's not that baseline of reasonable adjustments. I think that would be really helpful. I think, as I say, in general, I think the scheme is fantastic, and it's really the waiting times and the application process which need to address as well.
And James and Nick, any reflections on what you would want enhanced?
Go on, you go.
Well, I mean, one thing we've been calling for a long time is for the ability for someone to kind of passport their support between employers. So I think, coming back to that conversation about someone looking for work with a mental health problem, if they could go into that discussion knowing that certain support would be in place, I think that would give them and the employer more confidence. I mean, I do think it's a relatively low number of people who benefit from the scheme. I think I was looking before, it's only about 65,000 people a year. Mental health as a kind of primary condition is actually quite a high proportion of those people. I was surprised, if I'm honest, just like 38% of awards are being awarded where mental health is the primary condition. That's not the highest spend because other support costs more. But actually often these are things that potentially people should, some of it is like counselling, some of it is kind of brokering a conversation with the employer. So I do have a question about whether some of what's happening through Access to Work should be happening through the NHS or through HR or other schemes. But my fear would be that if you pull that support away on the basis that it could be happening elsewhere, it doesn't actually get filled by the other sources of support. So I think there needs to be a bit of a kind of wider look at why aren't people getting that support, and is Access to Work the best place for them to access it?
Yeah. Spoken about Access to Work so many times over the years. It's all exactly the same. It hasn't changed. I worry the department sort of boxed itself in, that it's got a defined budget from the Treasury to spend on Access to Work. It's never going to grow. It's only going to get smaller. But we also want to support more people with reasonable adjustments, and those two things don't really add up and create lots of problems. We also don't know the return on investment of Access to Work. It's impossible to know the benefit of Access to Work to the spend that we have. We think it's a good thing. We hear from lots of disabled people that it's a good thing. But it's important that we find out the exact, how is it working? How successful is it? Yes, dealing with the backlog is really important. I think we're hearing from lots of people who need support workers that unofficially their hours from support workers are being cut. Some are having to leave the workplace as a result. And yes, there's more employers can do, but there is this challenge that we want to get more people into work, but Access to Work only is in a finite budget, and that has to shift.
Can we just also, for both scope and mind, so in November the government said that they were consulting with disabled groups around changes to Access to Work. Have either of your organisations, to your knowledge, been engaged with that at all or not?
We have been engaged a little bit, and we are part of a consortium called the Disability Charity Consortium, which has been involved in that work. That work happened before Christmas, but we haven't heard anything since then. We've said lots of the similar points, that we really want to support more people to stay in work, and Access to Work plays a really key role.
Thank you. And Tom, any reflections from you?
We're in the same position. We're also part of the same coalition, so involved in similar discussions.
And James, you were just going on to some of the changes particularly, and you were talking about support changes around levels of support for people with support workers, strangely enough. Are either of you able to put any flesh on the bone around, because the government said, there's been no changes in guidance, we're just applying them differently, or words to that effect. Yeah. That's rhetoric, but what's the reality on the ground that you're finding from either clients with scope or mind? What's the facts on the grounds?
I could tell you very briefly about someone called Jamila, who uses Access to Work as a grant for taxis and 24 hours a week with a support worker. She's used that for a couple of years. She had to take some time off sick last year for several months, so didn't use a lot of her funding. As a result, Access to Work reduced her funding for a support worker to 8 hours a week, and her taxi allowances were reduced. She can't work without the right level of support. She works in the NHS, she does loads of site visits. That reduced funding means she can only go to 2 sites, she has to visit up to 50 for her job, and she's now handed in her notice. So official or unofficial, it's having an impact on disabled people. And these are people who want to be in work, and that's what we're hearing.
And Tom, any reflections?
I've heard kind of isolated anecdotal evidence of kind of reductions in awards or kind of more stringent application process, and the latest stats that came out, I think last week, did show a kind of lower number of approvals, I think, compared to last year. But I haven't heard anything kind of robust.
Can you clarify where those stats were from?
From DWP, it was kind of the annual, possibly, access to work stats, but basically showed a slight reduction in numbers of awards.
Great, thank you. And Chris and Ian, any reflection from yourselves on the areas that we've just covered at all? Or?
I mean, I've heard similar anecdotal evidence, but yeah, I don't think I have anything to add.
That's really helpful.
The only thing I'd add is I think that this thing about hybrid working and the changes that came after the pandemic, I've heard, yes, there are those stories undoubtedly, but there's also some positives. I've heard one or two in there where it's actually led to better working conditions and patterns, somebody working from home instead, different ways. But that's not going to be the same for all jobs, but if it's technical or office, but so in some cases there have been some positive outcomes from that.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you all for your evidence today. Chair.
Thank you. Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panel. I just wanted to, it has been mentioned already about disability confident, and in a previous life I've been through the form, so I do understand the process of disability confidence and can sort of reflect some of the conversations around it being a tick box. It doesn't really push employers on to do better. So there's been some changes to disability confidence. So do you think the changes go far enough? And do the changes take some of the good stuff out of disability confidence enough? And I'd be really interested to hear the view.
I don't think they go far enough. Scope doesn't think they go far enough. I think the scheme, as I mentioned, has got 20,000 odd employers on it of all sizes, potential to like significantly shift the problems that are highlighted in the Keep Britain Working Review if DWP and others really got behind it as a movement of employers to incentivise them. I talked about that bulk buying power of adjustments, to really think about the role of how can we support all these employers with better technology. It doesn't quite feel like we've gone from, which you've accurately described it, as sort of some cases a tick box exercise and a good piece of PR, to actually a lever DWP or others can pull to really tackle disability unemployment. And I think there's far more work to do on that.
Because there are other standards. I mean, obviously, disability confidence is just one of many. So are there others that the government should be looking at as an alternative? Because there are, the others in the market do different things.
They do, but disability confidence got the most amount of members. 20,000 employees, huge number of potential disabled people it could be employing. And it's been around for a long time. It's probably got some brand awareness. I'd argue invest in that rather than start something afresh.
Thank you, that's useful.
Yeah, I guess the only challenge, from a mental health perspective, is I don't know whether all employers bracket mental health problems in the same space as other disabilities. So, like I said earlier, mine has a separate mental health at work commitment that has about 4,000 employers on board. And I guess our real focus has been to to work collaboratively with those employers that have signed up for the commitment, to kind of push towards more active steps beyond just that initial accreditation and push for kind of reporting of what they're doing. So my read of the kind of shift in disability confidence is more towards that. So they're talking about not allowing employers just to kind of remain at level 1 and just use it as a tick box. I don't know whether many of the people mine represents would necessarily think, well, a disability confident employer is more likely to necessarily help me, employ me despite maybe having been out of work for a long time because of a mental health problem. So I don't know how much cut through it has, but I think, like James says, the potential is there in terms of if you've got all those employers signed up to this scheme who are showing some willing, it feels like you could be leveraging that a lot more to actually get action around employment and retention of disabled people.
I think I kind of touched on this earlier, but our view on standards in general is small businesses they could be doing all the right things, but just not be aware of it and not sign up to it, and can often become a bit of a PR exercise for larger businesses who are aware. And so our most recent survey, we found 23% of small businesses are aware of disability confident. Yeah, they could be doing, as I said earlier, they employ more disabled people proportionally, and you're less likely, if you're an employee at a small business, to take off long-term sick leave. So lots of them are doing the right thing without having that standard in place. And I think this is why we're a little bit wary of it in general. But having said that, I do think it does provide support to those businesses who might not necessarily know what to do. So that is positive. And as Tom and James said, having 20,000 or so businesses signed up is quite a good community to have. I think the changes that have been announced to make it more meaningful and to have more specific support for small businesses is a good thing. But I think, as James said, I'd like to see it go further.
Not being leveraged enough. It's as simple as that. Small and micros are fairly simple creatures. You know, what's in it for me? Why should I take any notice of this? And unless you're giving them reasons to take notice of it, they'll just ignore it. But it is a potential vehicle for those positive stories. This is what you can be doing. This is what best practice. Actually, in doing this, it's benefited this small business owner. Small business owners are terrible for listening to supposed advice, but they'll listen to Fred up the road who's got an experience. So if they hear a story from another smaller micro business, oh, he did that, and that's the way it works in that community. It's not very sophisticated. So I think, yeah, you could be leveraging it a hell of a lot more in terms of telling those stories and that education piece and best practice.
And looking at those very small businesses, I think one of the things that's really interesting, having been around small businesses for a long time, is they go and seek the advice when they need it. So they won't necessarily get a disability confident accreditation, and then they are faced maybe with one of their key members of staff with a disability, and then they go and seek about how do they support that person. So I think there is a different psychology to that, isn't there?
Yes, very much so.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're now going to Roshnara Ali.
Thank you. So, turning to older people, do you think that we need a dedicated piece of work to develop an older worker strategy, not least given disability is a big issue, but also post-pandemic, over 50s, the issues around not enough returning back to the labour market, and of course age discrimination. Perhaps Ian and Chris could kick off. Ian, do you want to?
Yeah, definitely. We saw, unfortunately, a lot of people leaving the business world after the pandemic, not necessarily because it was just like, I've had enough of this. There's all this, I'm faced with all this change is inevitable and natural, but it led to a hell of a lot of change. And we saw a lot of people going out of business earlier than they'd planned, retiring early, mid to late 50s, that's it, I'm out of here. And the more and they're still capable of working, but they're possibly looking for a different way of working and not the 9 to 5 and the grind. But actually, I'd love to work 3 days a week. I'd love to work in an FE college or work for somebody focused on a particular area of their business that they struggle with. So they're out there, but we just haven't harnessed that at all. So, yes, I haven't got the answer to it. Do I think there's a massive opportunity? Absolutely. But it's doing something about it, and that'll take a bit of creative thinking and getting used to these new working patterns and new ways. We said you've got to work 9 to 5. I could work in the evening and do so many hours for somebody. It's that. So I won't waffle on too much, but that'd be my answer.
A few more quick fire.
Yeah.
Time. Chris and others, do you all agree that we should have an older workers strategy? Chris?
I'm not sure about the specifics of having a strategy, because it seems like there's quite a lot of strategies at the moment, and whether they're all having a huge impact, I'm not entirely sure. But it's definitely something to consider. And I think I just add 2 points to what Ian was saying. I think firstly, really need to consider that self-employment is much higher among over 50s, and using that as a vehicle to maintain them in the labour market is very important. Also, reskilling and upskilling plus lifelong learning is really important, and adult skills budget has been cut quite a lot in recent years, and really would like to see that reversed.
Thank you. Almond James.
I don't know if anything much to add, to be honest. I think, there's understandably a focus on young people at the moment, but I think there is a risk within that. We also saw quite significant increases in health and disability among older people, and so wouldn't want that to be lost.
And I think just reflect that the older you get, the more likely you are to have a disability or long-term health condition, so reflect that.
The Mayfield review is, as we've discussed, it's a 3 to 7 year programme, and yet the state pension age starts to rise to 67 in April. We've had evidence from those who are in that period of transition, as well as those who were either made redundant or have, for different reasons, have left employment earlier and so on. Could you, building on what you've said, and please don't repeat what you've already identified, but any new ideas on what quick wins that can be identified to support these groups?
I think I've said mine. So,
Anything new? Any quick wins?
I'm not sure it counts as a quick win, but I just reiterate the point on over 50s being more likely to be self-employed.
Yep.
Self-employed people are a lot less likely to save into a private pension. So when we did a survey, we found that 52% of sole traders are not currently saving into a private pension. So they're going to be more reliable on the state pension. And I think it's really important the government considers that when doing this review.
It's not an area we've done lots of specific work on, so I wouldn't want to add anything on.
The only thing I could think of is whether there could be a vanguard that is specifically focused on older disabled people and what they're doing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that brings this session to an end. Order. And welcome back to this one-off session, which is looking at disability in the workforce. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Sir Charlie Mayfield, author of Keep Britain Working, which was published last year. So Charlie, I'm going to kick off with some questions, if that's okay. Can you explain a little bit more about how you aggregated the evidence that you published in your report in November?
Yes, certainly. So in terms of the approach to the review, we approached it in 3 phases. In short order, we called it sort of why, what, how. Actually, a lot of the evidence that we gathered, we did quickly at the beginning, and we published that in a discovery report, which was published in March. And it was actually incredibly valuable to get essentially the data analysis out there, the evidence out there as best we could. And that helped us to then shape the extensive engagement phase, where we basically held over 150 in-person meetings, in-person or virtual, but directly in the room with people, all across the country, and we had over 500 contributions to our portal. We aggregated all of that, and it was again so a summary of that was published, and then all of that was then fed into the sort of the how phase, which is really where we then worked on developing recommendations, which we published in November. So it all sort of carried through. But I would say that the report we published in November was more about both framing the urgency of the problem, describing the opportunity to resolve it, and then setting out the recommendations for how to do so.
Thank you very much. I wondered, within the evidence that you collated, I know that the UCL, University College London, was one of the institutions that you engaged with. I wondered whether that included the Institute for Equity, where Professor Michael Marmot currently resides.
It very probably. What I'm afraid I can't remember exactly is whether or not exactly where that fitted in, but we did gather a huge amount of evidence.
Okay, so the reason I'm saying is in terms of the epidemiology and the underpinning issues that we face as a country around the health of our workforce, as well as our working age population more generally. There's a lot of work that's been done by epidemiologists such as Michael Marmot. He actually led the Whitehall studies. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Nice. Yeah.
Which, for colleagues' interest, it was the first study that showed the hierarchical relationship between job strain, so you're more likely to die of a circulatory conditions such as heart disease if you are further down in terms of the pecking order in the civil service than that was, fortunately, colleagues, in the 60s and 70s, and I think improvements have been made since then. But there's a lot of learning from organisations like that. A question I put to the Secretary of State last week was in terms of whether we are engaging with the academic, we've got some world-leading academic centres on this area, and whether that is something that you want to harness, given the urgent need to try and resolve the issues around health and economic and activity.
Definitely yes, we do, and we have spoken to many of the people you've just mentioned, and so they were included in the sort of wider engagement phase that we did during the course of the review. I think what I would say though is that given our scope is really about employers and what more can employers do, we've sort of essentially taken all of those studies, which essentially say there is a very big problem, and it has a number of different characteristics which need to be addressed. And then we've sort of been mindful of that and then used that backdrop to then drive the engagement with employers to try and identify what we could do about it to fix it. And then the focus going forward is substantially about shaping those actions and those developments within the workplace so that we do a much better job of supporting ill health and disability in work. And data and evidence will be a very important part of that whole drive. And I think what we hope to do is to move from a position where, frankly, the data visibility in this area is pretty poor. I mean, in fact, you have to get academics to go and do bespoke pieces of work to understand it. We can move to a position where it becomes much, much stronger, and that'll be part of what we're seeking to achieve over the vanguard phase.
To be honest, I was quite surprised in terms of when you're saying around the paucity of evidence. It's a field that I worked in 20 years ago, and evidence was being collated. But again, getting back to the focus in the report, which is about this urgent need to address the issues around economic and activity, the health-related elements of that. And the comment that was said more than once in the earlier panel was, this is an urgent crisis, but we're going to take 7 years to come up with the solutions, and whether we can break this down to what we expect to achieve in the next 6 months, a year, and so on, your milestones around that. And as I say, there is quite a significant amount of evidence already out there, and that's what I'm saying. It's not necessarily needs to be bespoke, because there is already causal evidence. I've mentioned the Whitehall studies going back to the 70s about job strain, the type of jobs that you have, the importance. I think Tom Pollard mentioned that in the first panel about the relationship with your line manager being absolutely key. So how we can build on rather than start from scratch. I think that's the point I'm getting at.
Sure. So, what I don't mean to imply is there's a paucity of evidence. There's a lot of excellent academic work and studies that have looked in detail at the problem. I think where there's an absence of data is good workplace data about, for example, do we know what the absence rates are in lots of different sectors, regions, sizes of companies? The answer is we don't. Do we know what the return to work rates are in companies that manage occupational health well or poorly? We don't. So actually, my comment is really about the absence of workplace data, which gives us a real insight into what's going on there. That's really the issue. But to your point about sort of urgency, I feel that intensely. And on the one hand, I don't want to imply that the task we're undertaking can be accomplished too easily, because frankly, I think it is a complicated and difficult one, and therefore it needs to be. We do need to have an attitude which says we're going to make a very significant change, and it is going to take a bit of time to achieve that. Having said that, I have a real desire to move as fast as we possibly can, and actually in the review, what we effectively asked the government to support is a 3-year vanguard phase, during which time we will attempt to shift this system significantly. And actually, even since the review was published, and we've moved straight into implementation. So, I mean, for a start, we didn't pause. There was no gap in the sense of the report lands, and then people think about what they're going to do about it. We, the team, have moved straight into implementing the recommendations we've made to government. So in that respect, we're getting on with it with some speed. But also, I do think momentum is very, very important. I don't really see why we can't do a pretty good job of defining what the healthy working life cycle should look like and the standard associated with it, and defining what good workplace health provision should look like. I think we need to, you and others need to challenge us to do that within about 12 months. I don't think it needs to take longer. We may not have dotted every I or crossed every T, but we should have done the majority of that work so that within 12 months we are talking about specific changes that we are then getting on with figuring out how we implement them and get general adoption for those. Because I agree with you that urgency is very, very high here.
We'll put that date in the diary. Final question from me. In terms of small businesses, you obviously had a flavour there from the representatives from the FPB and the Federation for Small Business. And given that we're such a huge contributor to the workforce compared to medium and larger businesses, what are you going to do to make sure that they are properly supported? So when we're looking at healthy workforce or life cycle, that might be quite different in a small business, and particularly in a micro business. So how are you going to make sure that that is addressed?
So the first thing I say is we've already begun, and actually in the course of the review, during our what phase, the engagement phase, where we're out talking to lots of people, to be honest, the majority of the conversations we had with employers were with smaller and mid-sized enterprises, and we really emphasised those as a cohort, precisely because SMEs employ 2/3 of the people that work in the UK. They don't have quite the level of financial resources that large companies have, but they are incredibly important in terms of being a very large employer. So,
sorry to interrupt. Can I pick you up on? So I've just looked at my notes here, and I've got small businesses under 50, so 49 employees, medium size up to 250. It's still quite a large organisation by most people's, although that's they are defined as small. So how many of those SMEs that you talk to are actually small businesses?
Again, as you point out, there's a definitional challenge here. The majority of the smaller businesses we will have spoken to will be within the 10 to 250 sort of cohort. But it's not to say that we're not mindful of sole traders, for example, because I was on a call yesterday with the HSE and someone asked me a question from the Roofing Contractors Consortium, many of whom are sole traders. So they're very important. I think it's just that if you're trying to tackle this big problem, we probably will be more successful if we start sort of in the middle of it and then work out to the edges of it. And I guess what we've done is we've focused a lot of our engagement on SMEs with a view to making sure that as we think about things like a healthy working life cycle, we're doing that with them in mind. I mean, the team, it's become a sort of bit of a joke in the team, but I say to them, look, this won't pass the Hannah and Tom test. And Hannah is a wonderful woman who runs a fantastic business in Bury. And Tom is again, fantastic business owner and leader who runs a pub and hotel in Rochdale. And the whole point is that we have to have their mindset in mind when we are looking at how we're solving this problem. If we solve it for huge companies, we will fail all of those people. And those people, by the way, will take about half a second to look at something and form a judgment on whether it's been written with them in mind. So it's very, very important. On a practical level, we announced at the publication of the report that we had over 60 Vanguard employers. We did have a number of SMEs within that Vanguard, but the majority were larger businesses just because they're easier to reach in some respects. First of all, that number has now more than doubled to 125. We also had 5 mayoral authorities. We've now got 10. And the significance of the mayoral authorities is that we are really saying to all of them that we want to work particularly with them to reach their SMEs. And in fact, this week there's a third meeting in Manchester with the Good Work Charter companies in Manchester. There's 1,500 members of those. They're mixed sizes, but many of them are small and mid-sized. And so a lot of the mayoral authorities will be working with them directly to convene and engage with SMEs.
Good Work Charter started in Oldham, by the way. So, John Milne.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. In your analysis, you identify three key problems or challenges, which are fear, lack of a support system, and structural challenges. Could you expand a little on that analysis?
Absolutely, yes. So fear is of them, I think, the most important, to be perfectly honest, because it's the sort of human behaviour and factor which effectively, if it's present, it undermines the effectiveness of any structure or intervention. And essentially what we've got is a situation where, I mean, I'm going to generalise, but where if you are a person with an ill health condition or a disability, very often you will be fearful of telling your employer about that. And if you dig into that a bit, if you're a young person with a mental health issue, you probably don't even know it's a mental health issue. You may not even have got to the point where you've called it that. You just don't feel something's quite right. And again, in many cases, perhaps one of the last people you're probably going to tell is your employer, because you're nervous about how you might be treated, whether you'll be judged in a certain way. So fear is a huge issue, which means that, which a lot of people in that situation feel. But it is two-sided, because fear is also felt intensely by employers. And if you're a line manager, for example, and you're managing somebody, and you don't know, you're not a psychiatrist, you don't know what's going on, but what you observe is some issues, some behaviours. Often you'll be quite, and if you even see there's some health issue, you may often be quite fearful of even talking to somebody about that, because what you don't want to do is at a human level cause offence. You don't want to say something which might be considered to be inconsiderate. You definitely don't want to cause any kind of complaint or grievance. And this is then exacerbated also in some ways by HR teams, because if you have somebody who is, let's imagine someone has been signed off sick with stress, it'd be quite common for policies or HR people within organisations to say to people, for goodness sake, do not call that person when they're off sick, because what you don't want to do is make the situation worse. So fear is creating distance between people. And the fact is, when people are ill, when they're not well, distance is generally not a good thing. It's not conducive with good recovery. And this is a factor that we are dealing with, and it is partly why this problem is difficult. The second thing is about the system, and we don't have an ordered system for how we deal with ill health and disability in the workplace. There is, and some companies, some employers have extraordinarily well developed, very good systems of occupational health and support for employees, which are ingrained within the way they operate, and in many cases generate some particularly good outcomes. Right the way through to some companies which have almost nothing, and then many in between which have something. You have a lot of employee assistance programs and those kinds of things, but very often the take-up of those things is low. Sometimes because the awareness is not good, sometimes because people just don't. Again, it comes back to the fear factor that you don't necessarily want to use something provided by your employer. Almost to do that, you need to have crossed that threshold of fear and be confident that it's going to be really in your interest. So we have a whole range of issues there. And then added to that, we have a system whereby when people do get ill, and that their ill health condition gets to a certain stage, very often the first thing they'll therefore do is go to their GP. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's exactly the right thing to do. If you're unwell, you should go to your GP. But when you get to the GP, we're asking GPs currently to do two things. First of all is to say, what is your health condition and what should you do or I do to help you to get better? That's absolutely their role. But with the fit note, you're also asking them to make a judgment on the extent to which that person is able to work while they get ill or recovering from their illness. And that, if you just think about it, that's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, you don't know as a GP what the working environment is. You don't know whether the employer is very supportive or isn't very supportive. You don't really know, probably in enough detail, what the nature of the work is and how that might intersect with the capabilities of the person in question. And of course, you've got to do all of that within a fairly short space of time because you've got lots of patients to see. So the result is that 93% of fit notes just say people are not fit for work.
You foresee removing the fit note process altogether? Or?
Well, I think we have to be a bit careful. It's not within our gift at all. I mean, the fit note system is broad and extensive across. It has a number of different roles. What I'm pointing out is there is an issue in the context of the working environment, which I think is very well recognised. I mean, what I've said to you would, I think, not surprise GPs. I mean, we've had a lot of conversations with them. And so I think they're the first to describe the issue. So what we're essentially saying is this further exacerbates the problem. I mean, if you go back to my point about fear, if you are a line manager and somebody has a fit note, it can act as a bit like a firewall, almost the authority of the GP. The GP has now said the person who works for me is not fit to work. So I'm definitely not going to ring them and say, would you be able to come in next week? It just exacerbates that issue. So we do need to address all of that, and what we are seeking to do is to do so. The third point, just quickly, is all about disability, and in fact, it's not a quick point. It's you were talking a bit about that on the previous panel, but I think bluntly, a lot of disabled people are excluded from the workplace, and that is the truth. We have a disability employment gap which is far worse than many other countries, and that is an enormous cost to the individuals, and it's a huge cost to the employers and to the economy as a whole. I mean, I'll just give you one example. On a round table in Glasgow, there was a lady joined the session, and she was blind. She's working for the NHS. Came in with her guide dog, and just towards as we were wrapping up the session, she said in a very quiet voice, "I was 49 when I got my first job, and I had 5 degrees." And I think if you just imagine what 30-odd years of her adult life have been like, where she's effectively been so able and willing and wanting to work, but hasn't been able to find that. And that's just one example. I could give you lots. So this is a real issue. And of course, we pulled it out as a third point, but actually it's really the manifestation of the first two. Fear, lack of structure and support equals exclusion of disabled people.
It has been commented there's a relative lack of detail about this third structural problem and how you solve it. What would your response be to that?
So again, I think So what we are going to do and are doing is, and again I came in on the back of the last panel where you were talking about disability confident. We want to work with employers to say how do we improve this situation, how do we tackle these issues. And the good news is that there are actually a lot of employers who are very keen and enthusiastic to do this. We ran a survey recently with all of the Vanguard employers, ostensibly with the purpose of understanding which areas they were interested in helping us with in terms of developing solutions. And a very high, I think it was 74% of them said they were interested in working with us on disability inclusion. Now, this is not a cross-section of all employers, of course. I mean, these are the employers who volunteered to be vanguards are employers who are already feel this is an important topic and something where they want to be on the front foot in. So they're not by any way a cross-section. So I mean, in some ways it's a meaningless number, but I do think it's significant nonetheless, because it signifies there are quite a lot of people who want to work on this. And essentially what we're going to do is bring them together. We're also going to be working with a number of the disabled people's organisations and people like Business Disability Forum to then look at, right, how do we improve the situation as it stands today? And in the context of disability confident, our view is that if you talk to disabled people, a lot of disabled people are very, very disparaging because they basically feel that this is sort of good PR, but the outcomes don't justify it. And there's some evidence to suggest that even top-tier disability confident employers may not employ many more disabled people than people who aren't in the scheme at all. So what we are wanting to do, and this is very early days, is work with those interested parties to say, how could we improve that scheme? How could we improve that in a way, particularly focusing on whether and how we could measure outcomes? Because what I think we all want to see is more disabled people in employment. And if you're, to my mind at least, if you're as an employer, you're wanting to step forward as a disability confident employer, one of the outcomes should be you end up employing more disabled people and you retain them over time. So basically we're going to be working with them to try and figure out how to do that and work that into our overall recommendations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Chair. And obviously, because we've started on disability confident, I think just merge the two questions together would work. So you've obviously reflected onto the element of disability confidence and the fear that this is a tick box rather than really looking at how employers are employing more disabled people. So when we look at the healthy working life cycle as a formal accreditation and a standard, how do you think it will be different, and what lessons do we learn from the work that's done on disability confidence to make sure it isn't one another tick box exercise and does drive change?
Yeah, so I mean the first thing I'd say, I acknowledge, is we've got a lot of work to do, so we don't have all the answers yet, and I don't pretend that we have. The second thing I would say is that it's important not to conflate ill health and disability, but equally to recognise that in the context of an employer and an employer looking at their total workplace and practices within it, that you also wouldn't want to have a situation where you said ill health is dealt with this way and disability is dealt with that way, and they're completely different and separate. Because the fact is disabled people also get unwell, and actually people who are unwell develop disabilities. So you have to find a way to bring those two things together. But equally, particularly when you talk to disabled people's organisations, they're pretty vehement about the importance of keeping those two things separate. And I basically understand why. And so we are saying, right, we're not going to try and tackle the two together directly, but we also need to recognise from an employer standpoint that we do need to bring something, we need to reach a position which is both simple and coherent. Yeah. So we're going to tackle it that way. My view is that if you look at the different elements of the healthy working life cycle, I mean, just very quickly, there's recruitment and onboarding. There's hopefully a period where people are healthy and well in work. There's a period where they may get an ill health condition but stay in work. There's a period of when people maybe have an ill health related absence from work, hopefully from which they return. But if they don't return or they can't return to the job they were employed to do, then there's a redeployment. The focus shifts towards redeployment. If you think about that life cycle, the things that we are now working on include, in the context of stay in work, the development of a stay-in-work plan. We'd like to see that a stay-in-work plan becoming a feature within the UK employment landscape. And so one of the things we're doing with some of our vanguard employers at the moment is to say, well, let's take that as a concept, and can we flesh that out? Can we develop it and sort of put specificity around what that would look like? Now, very probably what that will include is, if someone has developed an ill health condition and they need time off for appointments, they should have time off for appointments. If they need some adjustment to their working practices, then they probably should have some of those adjustments, and there should be some mechanism whereby that can be agreed. And what I'm sort of describing are exactly the same processes in many respects, which are also required by disabled people who need reasonable adjustments. I think one of my observations is the word reasonable is very reasonable, but it's also poorly defined, and there isn't much support for employers or employees in determining what is and is not reasonable. And so again, part of the work we're going to do when we start looking at the provision, the providers and the support that need to be there to support employers and employees is how do we get people onto the pitch alongside them so that you've got some arbitration going on in the moment in the workplace that determines that. And I think, I could go into more detail, but I think that hopefully that's given you a sort of an impression of one particular part of the healthy working life cycle and where we think it could be highly relevant to disabled people.
I can understand the sense of trying to keep those things very, very separate. However, in the landscape that more employers will recruit at the point at which somebody already has a disability, the sense of a healthy life cycle is that you start healthy, whereas actually you can join at any point in that cycle. So in terms of employers and the formal accreditation, how will they be supported to do that, and what vision do you have for that?
So, first of all, I would agree with you. I've chosen one bit just to illustrate the point. Absolutely. So I'm not suggesting that that's the be-all and end-all. The whole point is this is a life cycle, and you're quite right that it's a sort of we need to operate across the whole life cycle and think about people moving between different phases. I mean, the other thing is that people will get ill and then they'll get better again, and then some people will, they'll there's a whole load of, I've done it as a linear thing, but it's not really. It's a whole series of circles. Should be. So that is definitely true. Now, what we are, the stage we're at the moment is we're basically saying to employers, look, we need you on the pitch. You need to be active in the context of ill health and disability. And the good news is that a lot of employers have joined us and said, we agree. That basically that's the vanguards. And what we want to do is work out now how we do that. So we have just started the first of what we hope will be 3 cycles of employer-led sprints to look at the detail of what needs to go into that. And there are 5 employer sprints, led sprints, which we literally are kicking off right now. One on data started on Friday. We will have ones on prevention, which will have a particular focus on mental health. We'll have one on stay and work, basically fleshing out what I was describing just now. One on return to work plans and how we develop those. And then the 5th one is on disability inclusion. So essentially what we're doing is we're working with employers to develop those. In terms of this question about, and that will be one cycle. We want to make a virtue of trying to do this quite fast. So we've basically said to these groups of employers, we can give you 8 weeks to work on those topics and give us your best answers after those 8 weeks. We will then evaluate where we are, share those findings with some of our vanguards and others, stakeholders, and then we'll go again with another set of sprints because by then we will have identified some of the next issues, and we'll do that again. We're aiming to do that 3 cycles over the course of this year, with a view to reaching a position where hopefully in a year's time we can come back and tell you this is what we think the healthy working life cycle really looks like and includes, this is what the provision needs to look like, and this is what the data picture needs to look like. Now, the question of how you do certification and accreditation is a really interesting one. And it's one that we want to tackle with a lot of care and consideration. You can have accreditation which basically says, let me give you a very long list of things that you must assure that you've done and tick all of it off, which could be practices, it could be having people, it could be having procedures. I mean, you can imagine what that could look like. And the challenge I always give to the team when that's where we end up looking at is, well, that will fail the Hannah and Tom test. It won't work. because they'll just look at it and take about 5 seconds to realise it's not for them. So instead, what we want to try to do is focus as much as possible on outcomes, because that's ultimately what matters to everybody. As an example, if people are off sick from work, they're absent from work with ill health, you're not worried about people being off ill for a week or two, because people get flu and they come back. But once somebody's been absent for 2 weeks and they're projected to be absent for a longer period of time, it should not be the case that they're just not in contact with their employer. Instead, there should be a process whereby a return to work plan is developed for those people, which, and again, we don't want to be overly prescriptive about the form that takes, and if we get into defining all of that, again, we'll fail the Hannah and Tom test. What matters, actually, is how many of the people in your organisation who were absent from work for more than 2 weeks successfully returned, and within what time frame. And so what we're probably going to be saying to employers, we want you to measure that. Now, what's interesting so far is that we've surveyed about 30 employers to look at what the data, what the measurement picture is currently, in terms of just asking them, what are you measuring now? And the vast majority of employers have some kind of measure of absence rates, so they know that there are X% of their staff are absent at any one moment in time. What's quite interesting is there are probably 20 different ways in which absence is being measured, and that may be valid, but our view is that probably once we get into it and understand it better, there may be 3 ways that you should probably be measuring it, and it would be quite helpful to all employers if we could tell them what those 3 are rather than them finding out. What we've also found is that very few employers are measuring successful return to work rates. But when you talk to them about it, when I have this conversation with employers, they go, that's interesting. Maybe we should, and you can see people writing it down, thinking, let's go back to our teams and say, we probably should start measuring that. So in terms of this, I've sort of, the accreditation point is I suppose what I'm trying to describe is it's a really important and it needs to be carefully considered, but we need to be also careful not to develop something that we're incredibly proud of and looks wonderful, but is totally inoperable for most of the people that need to use it. And we think that the answer to that is to focus on outcomes in the way that I have. And therefore data and aggregating data around this is really important. So one of the main recommendations in the review was for the creation of a workplace health intelligence unit. And so if you can imagine a world, if we get to a world where we said, this is the healthy working life cycle, these are the key outcome measures of different aspects of that. And to meet the standard, you must agree to share data confidentially with the workplace health intelligence unit. If you had thousands of employers doing that, you would start to develop a very interesting and potentially valuable data set. Now, you have to be very careful how you use it, because if you get into naming and shaming people or league tables, people won't join it, so it won't work. But imagine a world where you could say to an employer, let's say it's a retailer employing 100 people in the West Midlands, and they were able to look into that database and say, how are our absence rates measured in a consistent way compared to other organisations similar to ours? How do our return to work rates measure compared to other organisations similar to ours? Because again, one of the things you have to be very careful of is to sort of say that 2% absence rate is good and 4% is bad. Because if you're running a professional services firm, it might be the case that 2% is okay and 4% is terrible. If you're running a retail business, you'd probably say 4% is pretty good and 8% is bad. So we have to be very thoughtful and careful about how we use data and measurement, but equally it is an absolutely critical part of us creating a system that works and is self-correcting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And we now have Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. Workplace health provision. You propose like a certified standard, I believe. I'm just interested to know how you envisage that would work, and what support is there amongst employers for bringing that in?
So the healthy working life cycle is one key piece, and the workplace health provision is another key part of this. And what we're effectively saying here is that employers won't be able to deliver the outcomes from the healthy working life cycle without a level of provision and support from the workplace health professionals. And what we need to do is figure out what is the required level of support that employers must have in place. So again, just to give you an example of this, return to work plans. If you have somebody who's off sick and an employer, and you say to the two of them, come up with a return to work plan, there's a high risk, or there's at least a risk, that the employer says, well, I think you could do this, and the employee says, well, I don't, and you have no way of resolving that issue. If you add into that picture an experienced workplace health professional who can then arbitrate basically between the two parties, then probably, not in every single case, but maybe in 80% of cases, you can probably reach a sensible agreement whereby there's a return to work plan is arrived at. And so essentially what we're saying is that provision needs to be available to employers, and we need to figure out how to do it. Now, the good news is that kind of thing is already available in the market and is already provided probably in the order of 11% of current employees. If you have a group income protection policy or some kind of insurance policy that's provided by one of the big insurers, you will have within that organisation quite large numbers of case managers whose job it is to call you, the individual, and the employer and figure out how to do that. And they already do quite a lot of that. So what we're looking at is how could we make that kind of provision more available to more people without saying to people everyone must have a group income protection policy, because we're not here to make that stipulation. And again, we've had perhaps unsurprisingly, we've had a lot of interest from providers in our work. Within our vanguard, we've got over 30 providers, and they're all sorts of different companies. Some of them are the large insurance companies, but they also go right the way through to occupational health businesses, third sector. And we also have, interestingly, quite a few NHS organisations also within the vanguard, and particularly within the regions. So you probably talked about Work Well here at the committee.
So the national rollout of Workwell, how do you see this all evolving? Because you've got two separate things here. You see it all evolving into a single delivery program.
First thing I'd say is I think Workwell is well intentioned and actually is achieving some quite interesting results in the places where it is present. One of the challenges with Workwell is it's fairly small scale, to be honest, compared to the scale of employment across the UK. And if for example, the solution is for Workwell to be the answer to everything I've described, we would have to find a lot of money. Seriously, a lot of money to do that. You'd basically be talking about a national occupational health service, and you'd have to stand that up, and someone would have to pay for it. It's not obvious to me that kind of funding is available. Ultimately, the taxpayer would have to pay for it, and then you'd have to figure out how you did it. So I don't think it is a solution in its own right. Having said that, I also think that when you go to different parts of the UK and you talk to people on the ground in those localities, what you find is there are a lot of people who are trying to solve this problem. I often use this analogy, which is that if you go to any big cities in the UK, and this is again where the engagement of the mayors has been so good, is you find literally hundreds of people who are in some way involved in supporting workplace health in some form, or employees at least within that. And the analogy I offer is that if this table was covered with an iron filing for everybody who's already trying to help with this issue, it would be covered with iron filings. And the greatest arrogance and stupidity we could exercise would be to put them all on the floor and say we've arrived with this review and here's our iron filing, and everyone could go home and not worry about it. So what we want to try to do is think about how do we amplify and increase the impact of the people already there. And so one of the things we're very keen to do with them, particularly with the mayors in the regions, is explore whether we can find a route to making things like Work Well available to employers as well as employees, and also to look at whether there's any scope to look at funding mechanisms, whereby is there the scope to create pooled funding mechanisms whereby employers effectively can pay for some of that to enable the expansion. Because what we are certain of is that in order for the workplace health provision to be affordable and accessible to SMEs, we need to give the SMEs access to scale. If you're employing 10 people and you go to and you try and buy the workplace health provision just as a 10-person company, it's going to be unaffordable. If we can create the opportunity for you to do that as part of a scaled-up, pooled risk operation, then we think that you could probably get the provision that we think you need for in the order of £60 per person per year, something in that order, which is not nothing. I'm not saying it's an insignificant amount of money, but it's not £6,000 either. And so scale is very important, and what we want to try to do is figure out how we can develop mechanisms to do that.
Okay, Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Steve Darling.
Thank you, and thank you so much for giving up your time today to come and speak to us. Building on the workplace health programme, or provision, should I say, in 7 years' time, where do we get to, particularly focusing on small businesses? It's kind of like the so what question. Where will we be? What does results look like?
I mean, I'd be very. Again, we're at the beginnings of this journey, so it's perhaps, you know, we should be mindful of just how challenging this will be. But equally, I'd be very clear that our ambition should be no less than creating a fundamental change to the way that we handle ill health and disability in the workplace, from what is currently a pretty haphazard and system, if it warrants that word, with very mixed results, to one where we have a much better outcome, where basically it's the norm that we handle ill health and disability in is as proactive a way as possible within the workplace, with good support available for people to do so, and that has become generally adopted across the UK. And I think what we're doing is essentially doing the piece of work in this vanguard phase to figure out what that needs to look like, healthy working life cycle, the provision and the data. And what we've said is that the government will have a key role to play, which is how to assure the outcome. Because there will be, while my view is that actually there's a very good case for adoption of what we're going to be proposing, because it's good business, it creates a good return on investment in its own right. The fact is that we won't get everybody to adopt this, because you never do, and so the government will need to be a key actor in creating the incentives and aligning the incentives in such a way to encourage that adoption.
Thank you. I just want to unpick a bit further WHP, and the report talks about how this provision could assist with navigating access to work. Do you have any reflections on any reform that would be helpful around access to work to actually make it more enabling than what it is at the moment?
So I came in on the back of the prior contributors in the conversation you had with them, and I broadly agree with what they were saying there. So, and I think the other thing I should say is that the thing about Keep Britain Working is there are quite a number of policy adjacencies to the core of what we're focusing on, and this is one of those. So we're not saying that we are taking on the responsibility of trying to solve this, but also what we recognise is that we can contribute, and hopefully in a positive way. My view on access to work is that there is absolutely a legitimate and very important role for the government to provide support to individuals to enable them to work where otherwise they wouldn't be able to do so. However, there's also, I think, a legitimate expectation on employers to create the conditions where people can work. And the difficulty is judging where one responsibility stops and the other one starts. And I think it's compounded by the fact there's a finite amount of money, and there's obviously once there's a pool of money and people become aware of it, they tend to go towards it and look to use it, because one wouldn't one. And in my view, one of the critical factors that's got to be addressed is how do you determine reasonableness in terms of that, basically a dividing line between the two. And I find it hard to see how we're going to dramatically improve the situation without doing that. Now, I'm not saying that we in Keep Britain Working have the answer to that, because I don't honestly think we do. But I do think that if we can develop some of the things I've been talking about, you might get to a situation in the future where you've got workplace health professionals who are able to be at least make a contribution or to be inputs to that system. And also, it may also be the case that by improving the overall workplace health provision and looking to encourage innovation and a provider response, that you reduce the cost to employers of making the adjustments required that enable more people to work. So I absolutely feel that we can be helpful to that cause. I'm not saying that we are going to be the answer to it.
And can you just be a little bit more specific, and I'm aware of time as well?
So I suppose if you look at the two parts I mentioned, if you look at the assessment side of things, I mean, if we could reach a position where there is a more clearly established group of professionals, workplace health professionals, who can objectively assess an individual and what they require, and they're also in a position to reach an objective assessment of what is reasonable for an employer to provide. That would be a very useful input. And if you look at some other countries, I mean, some of the work we did looking at the Netherlands and Denmark, they do resource that. They have a whole in the Netherlands. They have UVW, which is a UWV, sorry, which is essentially the enterprise which assesses people in a very objective way. So an individual will be assessed by 3 different people, and they'll be given a score which determines their ability to work and what they're required to do so, and therefore the expectations that flow to them and or to the employer. So I think, again, we're not going to provide all of that, but I think we may be able to move us forward a bit on that front.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Rishnara Ali.
Thank you. My questions are partly on the intelligence unit. But before I go on to that, I just wanted to pick up on the access to work point. We took evidence from young people who had with disabilities returning to work in Durham on a visit this week. And in some cases, there are examples well documented. It can take many months, up to a year longer. And even if you are not eligible, it's helpful to know the outcome early when a job has been offered. It's devastating if you've gone, to achieve that success of being offered a job, and then that's the main barrier. Do you think that it does need to be much more work around reforming what works so that it's not creating barriers to employment when people have been given job offers?
So I have heard exactly that point, that somebody gets made an offer, but then they don't get confirmation of their access to work grant, and by the time that does come through, they've lost the job.
Yeah.
So that I have heard that story, unfortunately, many times. So I think this is a real issue. So I do think, apart from anything else, there are process issues with the current scheme, which are creating some very unfortunate outcomes. I think
does it not undermine what you're trying to do and what the government's trying to do?
I think it is a further barrier to it's a serious impediment to disabled people getting into work. And I think, by the way, I think one of your previous panel also mentioned passporting. Yep. I mean, if you are a disabled person and you find it hard to get into work and you've had to fight through a lot of stuff to get whatever you need to get there, yep, you're very, very unlikely to want to move job or go to another employer where you then have to, if that means you have to go through that whole rigmarole again with all the uncertainty. So I do think that disabled people face pretty severe restrictions currently, which we should all be very concerned about, and I would share that. I don't think it. I mean, I think what I'm describing is a current issue. It is an important and difficult issue.
It needs to be fixed.
And I agree with you. It needs to be fixed. It's just that I think we in the review again. I'm very sympathetic with the problem.
Scope creep.
But we can't. Well, we're not the government, and we've got a particular remit, and I think what we have to do is focus on trying to do that as well as we can, and being as helpful as possible to others who are trying to solve these other issues.
Thank you. On the intelligence unit, you mentioned a number of things that you want it to measure, which is really helpful. Do you see it also measuring savings to employers, whether in the public and private sector, if the data is then used to look at how employers are using that data to get better outcomes?
So we definitely think that the intelligence unit has a role to play in providing evidence of impact, and that impact can come in a number of different forms. We've already seen a lot of evidence to suggest that where employers invest in employee health and well-being, they get very good returns on investment. 7 times, 8 times, 11 times, even 20 times return on investment. So there is, we believe, a compelling investment case for employers. That wouldn't convince a lot of employers. They'll just think that's other people who they're not relevant to me and my business. So what we want to do is use the intelligence unit to increase the amount of data that is available and increase the evidence and make it more salient to the people who we need to reach. So that's definitely a role. But I also think it's going to be very important with a view to facing into government, because if, for example, an employer I'll give you a very specific thing. If you have a young person, and we mentioned this in the review, imagine a young person starting out in work and they lack social confidence. Like most young people, they have a degree of insecurity. They may even have some early stage anxiety issues for whatever reason, and they join a workplace. If hopefully they end up in a good place where their employer actually supports them actively. And let me give you an example. If that person turns up late for work, let's say, because let's face it, sometimes young people do because they don't quite realise the importance of that. It's incredibly important that the employer says it's not okay to be late for work. I need you to be here. And the reason I need you to be here is because you're part of a team. And if you're not here, you're letting down the team. Now, it's important to be clear with that person like that, and they might not like it. But if they then show up for work on time the next day, it's also really important for that employer to say, thank you for listening to me. I really appreciate it. You're now here and part of that team. And it's a micro example, but employers have the opportunity to determine whether that young person ends up on this trajectory, where they gradually get a sense of belonging, and they gradually gain confidence, they get a greater sense of what they can contribute, and they get onto a track which can easily lead to over £1 million of earnings in the course of a lifetime of work. The alternative is, if that person doesn't, and they don't get that experience, and they've already started perhaps in a slightly vulnerable position, and their sense of self-confidence gets squashed a little bit more every single day, then 6 months, 9 months, 3 years down the track, you may well find that person ends up going to see their GP and saying, I'm so anxious about work, and then they get signed off on a fit note, often for a month, and then another month, and another month. And what we know is if that person ends up distant from work, the chance of going back to work is very small. That's worth £1 million. That costs £1 million to the government. It's £2 million difference. And 190,000 young people have taken that path in the last 5 years. So the maths are pretty scary.
Yep. Agreed. The other role that the intelligence unit is due to play is designing incentives for employers. Obviously, you've touched on that. What incentives are you looking at first?
So the incentives are really, what we're really saying, that's for the government to sort of then incentivise adoption. Yeah. And so what we've said is we think there's a range that we can adopt here. So for example, almost the easiest end of this is to say in public procurement terms, if you are a standard, if you meet the standard and you achieve, you have all this in place, that should count in your favour from a procurement point of view. That's a relatively straightforward, easy thing to do. Next step along could be to look at some of the rules that exist currently around, for example, tax relief on investment in occupational health. You'll hear a lot from employers saying, well, if I pay for someone to have an operation they can't have on the NHS, but it means I can get them back to work faster, then they will face a double taxation issue from that. And so again, I'm not suggesting that you give a blanket tax relief for all employers on every expenditure they make. But maybe there should be some favourable treatment for people who are adopting the standard. Be another one. All the way through to, should there be tax incentives? Now, I mean, again, this is in no way is this agreed by the Treasury, of course, and it's not our job. All we can do is make recommendations. But if you go back to the point I made, if an employer, through taking proactive steps, is preventing a large number of people from ending up on welfare, that is of huge benefit to the state, and therefore maybe there should be some consideration of other incentives.
And my final question is about enforcement. Obviously, you've talked about, you're focusing on the positive engagement employers, but there'll be areas where there needs to be enforcement of equalities legislation, for instance. What are your thoughts on that?
So again, the enforcement and accreditation sort of sit side by side, because you need to know how we're going to deal with the accreditation. You can only really address this question of enforcement off the back of that. And again, I've sort of indicated that I think we need to be very thoughtful about that, and not least because even though we have an Equalities Act, which essentially says it is illegal to discriminate against people on a whole load of protected grounds, we still have an disability employment gap, which is frankly pretty shameful. And yet, I think even if you just took an enforcement route, I mean, again, quite a lot of the disabled people's organisations say yes, and so we should enforce it even harder. Yep. But the risk of that is that you might just find employers find ways that you're ratcheting up the fear on the employer side. Yep. To employ somebody with some kind of potential vulnerability. So I think we have to be thoughtful and careful about enforceability, or relying on enforcement as the mechanism to achieve change.
Yeah. So, but it is about quality and practice, and enabling good practice, though. Thank you.
Thank you. Damien Egan, last question.
Thank you very much, Chair. We had a really interesting visit in Durham, as other members have referenced, and as part of that we were talking to a group of people like pre-retirement, and we touched on this in the last panel. I'd like to know your thoughts, because it was overwhelming from the table that we were on, is the flexible working and bringing in elements about self-employed, but like the 1, 2, 3 days a week, where people coming in and being able to give their expertise. So I'd really like to know your thoughts around that. And obviously there's big regional disparities. So how can those be addressed?
So, I think we often we've talked a lot about. I've talked a lot about young people with mental health, because that's one of the biggest drivers of ill health conditions in the workplace. And of course, it's particularly important because you've got a lifetime of consequences ahead of people. The other biggest area is musculoskeletal issues amongst older people, and the fact is there's a lot of good evidence from people like Andrew Scott around longevity and keeping people in work for longer, and the economic value of that is huge. If you just increase the participation rate up to the age of retirement, it would do a lot for the economy. So I think it's a very important issue. In a way, I don't want to suggest that we've got the same answer to all the problems, but a stay-in-work plan is if that existed as a thing. If you as an employer and an employee had stay-in-work plans were commonplace in the workplace, you might well find that someone would say, well, look, I want to stay in work, but I can't stay in work doing 5 days a week, but I could stay in work doing 3 days a week. Can we find a way to do that? And have that as a supported mechanism would probably help with that outcome. I also think there's opportunity to look at where there are overlaps with things like the industrial strategy. We've made this point to various people, but quite a lot of the industrial strategy sectors have older than average workforces. And of course, the older people in those workforces have more experience, generally speaking, than the younger people in those workforces. And we want those sectors to be drivers of growth for the future. And so probably it's the case that keeping more of their older people in work for longer is important to achieving the objectives of the industrial strategy, and will be beneficial to those people. So I think there are a number of things which we should be looking to try and draw together to encourage that outcome. You very rarely meet people who say it's not a good idea to try and find ways to keep older people in work for longer. The question is, how do you do it? And again, that's where I think the healthy working life cycle potentially will be helpful in terms of developing some practices and some support that would enable that outcome.
Thank you. And that concludes our session with Sir Charlie Mayfield.